Start again, sorry. Good evening, everybody, and good evening, everybody at home. Sorry for the slight delay. We're in a different room this evening, well, probably for the next few weeks, and the tech isn't quite the same. So our two people here, Elaine and Robert, are trying desperately to make it all work. So I think it is working now, and hopefully you can all hear me at home. So welcome to you at home and to you here. And to Paul Goriup, who's going to speak to us soon about conserving the Houbara bustard, which is a bird from North Africa, mainly. I would like to welcome new members. We have a Dr. Claire Payne from Crowthorne, Angela Houghton or Horton from Reading, Adam Ward from Colnbrook near Slough, Amanda James from Mortimer, and Erica Johnson from Early. I don't think any of those are here this evening, are they? I think it's, no, they're not. Okay, but welcome anyway. Thank you for joining the club, and hopefully you will come along to some meetings. Right, are there any local sightings, please? I will just say that Jane and I went today to Aldermaston and we saw 33 waxwings, which was fantastic. Two separate groups that then sort of amalgamated, and there were some missel thrushes that were defending the mistletoe tree that the waxwings kept landing on as they were flying around. So that was really nice to see. And we had a nuthatch and goldfinch, and there was a bullfinch calling somewhere. But the waxwings were fabulous and quite flighty, but then they are, aren't they? Did anybody else here? Has anybody else here seen anything? Oh, the hawfinch, yes. Right, that was at
just one.
Aldermaston, right. So there was a hawfinch apparently at Aldermaston, but we didn't see that today. Flew across the road. Right, okay. Has anybody else seen anything? Okay, so Debbie saw her first firecrest of the year today. Where was that, Debbie? Oh, okay, singing. Where was it? Oh, Bucklebury. Right, okay, so that's nice. The firecrest singing at Bucklebury, Robert.
More Green Lakes, we've had some good birds, apparently. White-tailed eagle has flown over. Ooh. Yes, a bittern has been seen. And
not too many.
Marsh harrier.
Oh, right, okay. So Robert is saying that he's seen a white-tailed eagle. Well, you have seen it. Oh, okay. It flew over Moor Green.
Yes.
A white-tailed eagle and a marsh harrier.
Yes.
And a bittern apparently flew over Moor Green, but Robert didn't see them, sadly. Anybody else here? Yes. Oh, so Bill had red poles in his garden. That's just showing off now, isn't it? And so I can't quite hear you. 4 firecrests at your allotment. Oh, jumping around in the brambles. Wow. Okay. No, they can be quite confiding, can't they, actually? Wow. And that was at Bullmush. Okay, that's nice. So 4 firecrests jumping around in the brambles at Bullmush. Okay, 2 redpole in Courtney Drive at Emma Green. Anybody online, Elaine, saying they've seen anything? No. Okay. Oh, sorry, Fiona.
Yes, we've had, whereas we occasionally just get the odd lesser redpole. We've had probably about 75 around. You know, the floods have made lots of things move around. And
right.
We actually had stone shad actually in the garden for the first time ever. We had one in my neighbour's garden sort of 30 years ago.
Right. Okay. So
redpole, big block of redpole, and we've had loads of some hundreds of common gulls, whereas once again we only normally get a few.
Right.
Course,
okay.
With the floods,
so Fiona lives by the river. Is it Marlow you live? Hurley. Okay, so Fiona lives by the river at Hurley, and she said the water has pushed in quite a few birds, and there were lots of redpole, you said?
It's lesser redpole.
Lesser redpole. Common gulls.
It's common gulls. Yes.
Okay, and common gulls. Right, lovely. Okay. Right, so we shall now get on to welcoming Paul. Paul Goriup is a life member, I'm told, which is, he's probably been there 5 times as long as I've been belonging to the club. I think it's something like 50 plus years, which is very impressive. He has acquired, and I have abbreviated this somewhat because there's so many wonderful things said about him, I've had to abbreviate a little bit, but Paul has acquired more than 40 years experience in nature conservation, working in various significant departments. For 4 years, he directed the global conservation programme of the organisation now known as BirdLife International. He has been chairman of the Bustard Specialist Group, and in 1986 he founded and is the managing director of Nature Bureau, which is a Newbury-based company that carries out ecological research, planning and management projects. He is a trustee of the Great Bustard Group that has successfully reintroduced the Great Bustard to Wiltshire. Right, so could we all please then welcome Paul Goriup to hear about this lovely bird.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. This is something of a nostalgic evening for me because I used to get my zoology lectures here of the BSc students in this very lecture hall in the mid-70s. So, and this talk is also going back quite a long way. So you'll just have to put up with me saying back then, in the old days, it used to be like this. We'll see how we get on. Can we start? So, okay. Finally got the setup going for the presentation. It's always a little bit tricky with these things. So the Houbara bustard, Houbara is just the Arabic word for this bird. So if we say Houbara bustard, we mean the bustard as far as Arab speakers are concerned. So actually it's just the Houbara. And under recent taxonomic changes, of which, as I'm sure you know, there are a lot of them going on at the moment, it's now split into 2 species. A western one, which occurs on the Canary Islands. It's not quite shown on this range map, but just off the west coast of Africa on those islands, Fuerteventura, Lanzarote, and then goes across North Africa more or less to the Red Sea, and then from then on in Arabia through to Central Asia and China, it's McQueen's bustard or the Asian Houbara. And I'm talking today mainly about the Asian Houbara, the one that gets into the Arabian Peninsula, although this story actually occurs in terms of hunting right through the range, except for the Canary Islands, which is an EU member and strictly protects the bird, and there's no falconry there. So most of the year, like most of the bustards, they're pretty cryptic, difficult to see, and as boring as anything. They just sort of hang around, come out. They're mostly omnivorous. They feed and disappear again. These birds, when they sit down, they just disappear. Their camouflage is so fantastic. But for at least 3 months of the year, when the males are displaying, it's absolutely fabulous. And that's actually what got me into looking at bustards altogether, starting with the great bustards on Salisbury Plain. And then one thing led to another, and I ended up spending the better part of 20 years working on this bird. The male has a spectacular display. I was going to put a video in the presentation, but then I thought better of it because it often doesn't work. He has these fantastic neck plumes, black and white, and on the breast. So the display involves in the first stage just erecting all of that and elongating, disclosing them from the camouflage along the neck and on the chest, on the breast. And then in the second stage there on the top right, he throws his head right back and he starts clicking his bill. If you get close enough, you'll hear a sort of call. And then amazingly, it seems to be completely blind. He starts trotting around with this great sort of ball of white feathers on the top of his head. And occasionally he does trip, occasionally he does hit a bush, so he doesn't really see where he's going. But I think he has a very well-worn path, and he tends to do a kind of figure of 8 pattern or a circular pattern. And then at the end of that display, which lasts maybe a couple of minutes of trotting around like this, he suddenly runs somewhere, stops, and then all the feathers are relaxed. He sort of preens a little bit, looks around, sees if any females have come. If they haven't, he starts again. And quite often, if a female does come, she doesn't go right up to him. He has to go and chase her, and then you get these spectacular flight where you suddenly see all the white in the wing. So that is really an amazing experience, and you can see that on the Canary Islands if you go from middle of February through to end of March, early April. It's really worth doing on Fuerteventura. There's plenty of birds there. If you hang around on some of the plains, you'll soon see that. The rest of the life cycle basically involves the female. She's the only one who is taking care. Obviously, she's going to lay the eggs, which is just a scrape on the ground, usually in a soft sandy place, but it could also be fairly pebbly. Usually not near anything, so it's not under a bush or next to a big stone or anything like that. It's just out in the open, but they're very well camouflaged, and so they are quite difficult for aerial predators or ground predators to see. And she incubates them alone, 22 days, and finally they hatch out into these fantastic little chicks, also very well camouflaged, like partridges and other. I mean, this is not a game bird. This is actually related to cranes, but like game birds, they can walk and feed fairly quickly after just being hatched. So the female leads them around, shows them the terrain, shows them what's good to eat, and they stay with her right up until the winter, when they tend to disperse, and in Asia from November, they're starting to come south into the Arabian Peninsula. So once upon a time, there was a kind of harmony between Arab falconers and Houbara, because the Houbara was coming down in very large numbers. A few were actually breeding in the Arabian Peninsula, but most of the time they were coming in from Pakistan and Central Asia into Iran, into Iraq, into Emirates and Saudi Arabia, and wintering there. And for the tribes people, for the Bedou, having a falcon and going out to hunt Houbara, first of all, got his son there. This was a sign of virility to catch a Houbara with a falcon. It was very much part of your manly attributes to be able to train a falcon to catch a Houbara, because the Houbara is the largest bird that one of these sakers can really catch. So it needed a lot of bravery on the part of the falcon to take it, and therefore a lot of skill to train a falcon to do that, in fact. And secondly, it provided protein, because in the desert there wasn't really a lot of meat around to have, and Houbara are quite tasty. I've never had one, unfortunately, but apparently they're quite tasty. And so, you know, it goes to complement the rest of what would have been a rather poor diet. And the falconry in those days was done from camelback, and it was a kind of traditional pastime in the winter to go out hunting. And the falcon is very much a part of the culture of the Middle East, of the Arabian Peninsula in particular. You'll see it like here, it's on the UAE and their falcon emblem. They produce stamps to celebrate the falcon and falconry, again in the UAE, and this one, Bahrain. And even you can buy a Houbara soft toy online. So if you like this talk, you like Houbara, buy a soft toy. The falconry is done in quite a lot of different ways. So here this guy is running off after the Houbara to flush it up so that the falcons can see it, because even on the ground, it's sometimes difficult for a falcon to see the Houbara. And it makes for a more spectacular chase if the Houbara is flying than if the falcon just comes on top of it. The usual technique is you have an older falcon with you that's experienced, and that's called the spotter, and you're carrying that. One of your assistants is carrying it rather, and when the falcon starts to bob its head, it's seen a Houbara and you know roughly in which direction to go, and then you have another falcon to actually do the hunting. So that's released. This is a peregrine that's being released after seeing a Houbara. There can often be quite a chase and a fight. The falcon doesn't always get its way. In this example, the falcon is actually not coming off so well. And in fact, the Houbara also has another defense mechanism of ejecting a very sticky feces, rather like a fulmar does from the front. And if the falcon gets hit by that, it's grounded. So the Houbara, 90% of the time it's done for, but sometimes it does actually get away. That one is just about to escape from a jur. But generally speaking, that's the end of the story. That's the sake of the. Oh, sorry about this bar.
Right.
Yeah, I'd like it to disappear, but there we are. Maybe on more, I can just turn it off. Of that, it's better at the top because most of the photographs are lower down. Okay, and this sport of falconry. Said hoping to get another picture up. There we are. This is you may recognise this guy, Sheikh Mohammed Al Maktoum from Dubai. It very much became an aristocratic sport event after a time, and particularly with oil wealth coming, more wealthy Arab falconers were able to splurge out a bit more on their falcons, and so you have various grades of falcon. So when you're training, you start with a peregrine. The peregrines aren't well regarded as birds for falconry. In fact, what they really want is a saker, because that gives it has a different technique, because the falcon peregrine, as you know, is sort of circles and then stoops on the bird, and that doesn't tend to give much of a chase. You don't see much until the peregrine suddenly hits the Houbara. With the saker, it's more of a chaser, like a sparrowhawk. So when the Houbara takes off, the saker will chase after it and then goes up and lands on the top of the Houbara. So that looks, and then a bit of a fight ensues on the ground, and that's more interesting to watch. And for some reason, Arabs think that the best falcons are the paler, bigger ones, which happen to be female sakers, as it happens, but they're always called males, because it's obviously got to be male if it's bigger. And the biggest and palest of them is jur. So they have started a market in buying jur falcons from Scandinavia and Iceland and so on. There's a big trade in it. You probably all heard about the smuggling. A bird like this would probably have cost him somewhere in the region of $50,000–$60,000. So that's really had a dramatic effect, not only on both the falcons and the Houbara. The falcons from the trade and the Houbara from the hunting. The falcons, because they're so valuable, are very well kept. In Bahrain, for example, I visited this building, which is an air-conditioned saker home. They all have their individual pens, and they're completely looked after by a vet who cares for them and makes sure that they get through the summer, because normally Saker falcons come into the Middle East at the same time as the Houbara in the winter. They come down from Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and so on. And they were trapped by local Bedou, trained to catch Houbara for a few weeks, go out on the hunting, and then at the end of the season, the Houbara were returning and those birds were released. But obviously, if you've spent, that still happens, but if you find you've got a particularly good falcon, you don't want to release it, so you over summer it in these air-conditioned facilities. The sort of more hidden, horrible side of all of this is that trapping the falcons involves quite often using lures, like this lagger in Pakistan. It's been tied to snares. It looks as though it's got prey. That's very attractive to a saker to try and rob it. So it comes down, tries to rob whatever this bird may have caught, and then gets caught in the snares. They're really not well treated. You see a bunch of sakers here cramped onto that cradle. And the Houbaras themselves are also increasingly trapped and traded. In this case, when they get to the Middle East, they'll have their primaries clipped a little bit, and then they're used to train falcons on them. And it's well, not very nice. Up until the mid-1960s, this is how it was. And the tradition carried on. It had these rather nasty elements to it, but it was still okay. But as the wealth grew and hunting became more and more of an elite sport, Arabia could not sustain the level of hunting that was going on. There are not enough Houbara in the country for that. So this guy, Aga Hassan Abedi, was setting up a bank of Credit and Commerce International, and he hit upon the idea of inviting these Gulf Arabs to hunt in Pakistan, because he knew that there were a lot of Houbara in the country somehow. And so he invited Sheikh Zayed bin Nahyan, who was the ruler of UAE in those days, to come and try out the sport in Pakistan. And of course, this was the start of his business and growing his bank into a major international, highly corrupt organization, laundering money, dealing in drugs and all sorts of things, to such an extent that finally in 1992, he was arrested, put in prison, and the bank was folded up, funnily enough, by Abu Dhabi, but by the descendant of Sheikh Zayed, not himself. However, the damage was done. Suddenly the Arabs understood that they could hunt Houbara up the migration route between the Middle East and into Kazakhstan, possibly, if they could. They would go even into China. The first hunting trips were done on a rather small scale, a few vehicles, four-wheel drive vehicles, mostly Range Rovers or Toyota Land Cruisers, sometimes quite highly customized. It was not unusual to find a Range Rover with an extra axle, 6 wheels, special suspension, seat with gyroscopic stabilization, sometimes even with a mounted gun on it, not for shooting Houbara, but for shooting gazelles or anything else that moved that they came across on the way. Convoys like this were going out, especially into Baluchistan, which is the main area for Houbara, and they would set up their falconry camp. There you can see they've got about 10 falcons. That's what it was then, 10, 15 falcons. And this is the cook, because again, they're cooking the bird. They're actually, he's got Houbara wings there, and they eat the Houbara in situ. If they can't eat everything they've caught, they freeze them and fly them back home. And about this time, this all became very glamorous for the falconers. and rumours started circling that this was really amazing hunting grounds, and these Houbara were not only tasty, but somehow they were aphrodisiacal, and so they became an even more attractive lure. Personally, I think that if you've been in the field for 6 weeks hunting with another group of men, by the time you get home, you don't really need an aphrodisiac. But as the attraction grew, more and more facilities started to appear. So this is in Quetta, a private airport made for the Arab falconers to discreetly arrive in their aeroplanes, which now didn't carry so many people as falcons. And now that we're seeing 50, 60, even 100 falcons coming out to do the hunting. So the number of birds that were being caught in the winter went up from about 1,000, 1,500 a year. Now it's nearer to 4,000 or 5,000 a year. And that started to have an impact, of course, on the population. The world population of the Houbara is only about 90,000. So you're losing 5,000 a year from hunting. That's virtually knocking out any recruitment to the population. In order to, I was going to say oil their way, but that'd be too horrible a pun. This did not happen just, gratis. Pakistan was quite prepared to make it a commercial proposition in a way. So it was not quite so much, it wasn't quite as grubby as just handing money over. What happening was that they were doing development projects in Baluchistan in return for getting a hunting permit. And eventually the whole of Baluchistan was divided up into about 6 hunting territories for Qatar, Kuwait, Saudi, UAE, and one other there. But and so these sheikhs were coming there and hunting in more or less a sort of private area. And in those areas, they would build schools, roads, schools. That's a big college that's being bought, mosques and all sorts of things to do community extension, because after all, they're hunting there quite often on tribal lands. And some of the local chiefs weren't too happy about it until they found out that at the end of the hunting season, they would get all the vehicles and a load of guns. And then it was all right. And the scale of the hunting, as I mentioned, just went through the roof. And it began to dawn on people that something ought to be done about it. And nobody's really quite sure how to go about it, because in fact, you're dealing not with poachers. This is in-your-face hunting done by rulers of countries and their families. So this became a very much a diplomatic issue, which WWF, amongst others, wanted to try and solve. And at that time, in the early to mid 80s, I'd been working on the great bustards at Salisbury, and somebody needed what they thought was a bustard expert. Doesn't take long to become a bustard expert, because there's only about 10 people in the world that do anything with them. So I was asked to go out and start seeing if there was some way of doing conservation. Actually, the idea then was to do captive breeding, to see if it was possible to breed the birds and release them for hunting. So some of the literature that was coming out around that time to provoke these kind of thoughts, it was becoming more embarrassing for the Arabs, actually, with all this kind of international press vilifying them and their sport, quite rightly. I published something about the world status of the Houbara. I did this article in Birds magazine back in the 80s, and other international press. And actually, every October, if you just go on to Google and look for Arab hunting, this is still going on. These kind of articles doesn't make a jot of difference. They still go out to hunt with essentially impunity. So didn't have all those facilities. I started off in Pakistan. I didn't have a palace. I had this hut. I had one person to help me looking for Houbara, and that was my vehicle up there, which actually would have been better if I'd walked most of the time. Anyway, we tried to find out what was the population levels of the Houbara, what was the degree of hunting, where they were hunting, how they were hunting, and so on. You've seen some of the photographs, and just get some data. And well, it was rather tricky, but at the same time, it was possible actually to go and talk to those hunters. You could just turn up at the camp, and they were very friendly, and you could have a chat about their hunting. And a lot of these photographs I've shown you, I took myself whilst chatting to them about their hunting. And I began to understand that they didn't feel that they were slaughtering these birds as such, because they were, we come every year and we get the same numbers and they're always here. So what's the problem? And in fact, when I started to map out things, they weren't very far wrong. It looked very dramatic and bad, but at a population level, there were many places they couldn't hunt. They couldn't hunt in India, which is a major range state. India's never allowed hunting. It's your machine. It's a very eventful evening. That's no. There we go. Oh, I can even see the pictures here now. So it was getting darker and darker on this screen. So they couldn't hunt in Iraq because there have been wars there in the 70s. They couldn't hunt on any border. It's certainly not between Pakistan and India or Pakistan and Iran. That was just completely closed areas. So there were huge swathes of territory that they couldn't get to for legal reasons, or they were just out of bounds. In fact, quite often, if an Arab hunting party found itself too close to the Indian border, they were actually escorted out by the Pakistan army. And the other thing is that the hunting involves racing across the desert in a four-wheel drive vehicle to flush a Houbara and release your falcon. Now that you can do that on that sort of terrain up there, but as I'll show you soon, there are other types of desert that the Houbara use where that is actually very tricky to hunt over at speed. So actually there are large areas of the desert where they couldn't go even though they wanted to. And if you took all of that into account, you started to see that maybe there was a way to manage this hunting in a way where you could zone where hunting would be permitted, where there would be closed areas. It would be just like like grouse management that we do in this. Well, that's a bit touchy subject actually, but obviously the grouse management in this country is not quite what it ought to be. But it would be something like that. You know, you'd actually have a sort of sustainable hunting regime. And then you would try to redirect all this money that they were spending on this sport, because when you did the calculations, each Houbara they were hunting cost them about $5,000. You take account of the cost of the falcons, the staff they would have. A camp more recently looks more like a huge film set, you know, air-conditioned caravans, satellite dishes to keep in touch with the home country, all the best food flown in. I mean, it's just a completely different deal these days. So there was this inkling of the idea already in the early 90s that we might be able to, with their cooperation, devise a system which would allow them to keep hunting, because it was always my opinion that they would get to a point where it wasn't actually worth hunting anymore. The Houbara would never go extinct because of these areas they couldn't reach. But their hunting wouldn't be worthwhile. I mean, even Arabs would probably find $20,000 or $30,000 for one Houbara a bit over the top. And perhaps I'll take a break there and get on to the second part of the story.
Okay, thanks, Paul.
Thank you. So we've got to the situation where hunting of Houbara by Arab dignitaries is reaching a scale which is getting international attention. It's causing consternation in conservation circles. I've been out doing some research in Pakistan, and I'm not so sure the problem is as bad as it might be stated at that time. I even got the impression there was a lot of just simple prejudice against rich people out hunting rather than the impact on the birds itself. And I started to see some opportunities to actually engage with some of the hunters, some of the more enlightened ones, about possibly doing some conservation work with this situation. So I went to Saudi and Abu Dhabi and Bahrain, taking up the invitations that I'd been offered. You know, if you're ever in the country, says this prince or that prince, come and see me. So I did, and it was amazing. They just were very happy that somebody came to see their birds. Every one of them in his back garden, which was quite large, had a pen of bustards. Not only Houbara, but sometimes they were collecting them from different parts of Africa. So I saw my first Nubian bustards in captivity there. They're pretty rare. You don't see those very often. A lot of quarry bustards, of course, because they're relatively easy to get. White-bellied bustards, heart-logs bustards. I mean, there they were. And as a person who liked bustards, we could talk and engage about this. But their idea was captive breeding, and they were very much taken with the idea of when they weren't hunting bustards, many of them were hunting grouse here with falcons. So they understood the idea of rear and release for partridges, and in Spain also for red-leg partridges and pheasants. And because the Houbara looks a bit like a game bird, they thought it was the same. Didn't appreciate that it's a completely different bird, more akin to the crane. And you know, my relations in terms of getting expertise in this area is more with the International Crane Foundation in America than it was with anything that's based in the UK. So in Bahrain, the sheikh there had built this duplicate of a breeding cage, which was used for the Australian bustard. He'd seen a picture of it and built it, but without understanding anything about the biology of the birds. These wires. So it was a great idea to have a tower in the center so you could see the whole area. He just hadn't put an access point to it or a screen to get there. So if there were, when I was there were no birds, but if there had been, and we walked in through that gate at the beginning, they would have all been completely scared and run off to the edges where they would have probably beaten themselves and broken a wing on the outside fencing. Or when you got into the tower and looked down, the wires sort of come down like this. It was just a death trap for any bustard that would fly up and try to get from one side of the aviary to the other. More modern facility was being set up in southern Saudi Arabia. This was based on the Israeli idea. Well, it wasn't an idea. It's just that in Tel Aviv, zoo, they happened to keep a couple of bustards in a small enclosure. And then one year, by once coincidence, the female laid some eggs that were fertile and hatched a chick, and then it promptly died. But that was the first time a Houbara had been bred in captivity, or hatched a chick in captivity. And so this idea was to replicate that just on a vast scale, lots of small cages. In Abu Dhabi, they built the world's largest aviary because they could. And they thought the best thing was just to have an enormous space. And this one, I mean, the inside of it is just astonishing. And I thought maybe they're going to put Houbara in there and breed them and hunt them in there as well, because it was just so huge. Look at that. Much more sensible. Sheikh Mohammed, he had this small backdoor aviary with a few Houbara in it, and it was much more subtle and appropriate to potentially captive breeding. The units were large enough for the birds to have a certain amount of mobility. The wiring was very low, so they couldn't fly up very high and all sorts. So there we are, deep in discussion about his bustards and how we can try and breed them for him. And then ultimately, the National Wildlife Research Centre in Saudi Arabia built the Houbara farm. I mean, this is millions and millions of dollars worth. You've got so a sort of central administration area here, and then just cages and cages and cages for breeding Houbara. They'd found out that actually under these conditions you have to use artificial insemination. So they had lots of facilities for collecting semen from the males to inseminate females. They double clutch the females. I mean, it's just a farm. And the only contribution I was asked to go and review this at an early stage of the planning, and I just said, "You're mad. What on earth do you want this for? Because where are you going to put those birds? There are going to be hundreds, if not thousands, of these birds, and they hadn't even thought what they were going to do with them when they've got them, because there was nowhere left in Arabia where you could sustain that number of birds, even if you release them for hunting. You wouldn't be able to catch them all, and the ones that were left over will simply die because there's no real habitat. So my main contribution was this, which was a quasi natural habitat for Houbara, where we could release a few birds and actually see what they do when they get in the wild. But for one reason or another, it was never used, and I actually fell out with the Saudis. You know, once this sort of thing started, I wasn't very happy, and I actually moved then to work in Abu Dhabi. Captive breeding was the thing. Oh, that's the inside. I mean, just it's ripe for disease. It's the birds are all imprinted. You release them, they can't feed themselves because they've only ever had artificial food. It's just horrible. And when they do get to release these birds in the wild, it's a really major event. Up there is this is Prince Sultan, who eventually became king, and all his hangers-on coming to watch some Houbara being released from these white boxes into a habitat which they'd fenced off a vast area called Mazet Al Said, not far from Jeddah, and none of those birds survived, not one. Mind you, they only released about 10. They eventually, after many years of trying, a few birds did succeed in surviving, but actually it was just a disaster. At the same time, so in '87, before all that kind of massive captive breeding started, I was in Saudi working at something that they just set up called the National Wildlife Research Centre, what is it? National Wildlife Research and Development Agency. So because they thought about conservation, but they were also thinking about development. And they explained to me many times why they use that word. And for the life of me, I can't understand even now what they meant by development. But I suspect what they actually meant was captive breeding later on, because virtually everything, the gazelles, the oryx, the Houbara, they were breeding all of those in captivity. And I suggested to them that in order to think more about management of Houbara, we ought to perhaps have an international symposium and get Saudi more engaged in the international community. This was my idea, that maybe we could persuade them to do something a bit more conventional, shall we say, in terms of conservation. And in the process of developing this symposium, I was asked to go and see Prince Saud Al Faisal, who was then the foreign minister of Saudi, in his big town palace, together with the guy who was setting up all that captive breeding down in Taif near Jeddah. And we were sitting there and presenting our cases. So him for captive breeding and me for let's try and develop natural habitat. Let's reduce the grazing pressure on the deserts. Let's have some protected areas. And Saud listened and he said, well, we can do both. So Paul, you're going to work on protected areas, and this guy from France will work on captive breeding. All I can say is he made a lot more money than I did. That thing. And we started then bringing in international experts to talk about what we could do in terms of an overall conservation strategy for Saudi Arabia, including restoring Houbara populations there. I threw that in for Debbie. Did you go there? Yes, in the old days. And one of my tasks, actually, the National Commission was working to train local Saudis about bird watching and well, that was fun. So I started working on a protected areas plan. This map is the current protected area system of Saudi Arabia. The first one up here, Harat al-Hara, was done specifically for Houbara, because there were reports there might still be a few up there. And I travelled there with Prince Saud and his entourage, and we drove around the place. And eventually, after a lot of pushing, he agreed to set it up as a protected area. I think that's probably the highlight of my career. 120,000 square kilometres of protected area. Yes, it's desert, but it's my desert, and I'm very happy with it. The other place, Mazet Al Said, where they're releasing the captive birds, is this one here. And then they have other places, and it's actually more developed even recently, even with some marine areas too. So other people have carried on that work, and the system is developing quite nicely. And that's me driving into, as you can see, the well-marked border post for Harat al-Hara. So what we wanted to do is, if we were going to do conservation, we needed more information about this bird, its population, its movements, how many of them are staying resident, how many are migrating, where do they actually migrate to, for how long, all these questions. Because we couldn't have an agreement until we knew which countries would be the range states for that agreement. So those of you who are in Hampshire might know this guy, John Norton. He's still around doing conservation work. Patrick Osborne from the University of Stirling and so on. We started to do field work to try and see what sort of habitats the Houbara actually uses. And this Harat al-Hara, it means boulders. Harat is, so you've got Harat, you've got Reg, and you've got sand deserts. Reg is the sort of stony plains. And this stuff is a volcanic area where the lava, the basalt, has broken up under the freeze and warming system because it's near the Mediterranean. So it gets hot, very hot in the summer and quite cold at night. And this eventually cracks the lava fields into these boulders. And you cannot drive across that at speed, hoping to catch a Houbara. And what you do, because those of you who've looked for Houbara might find them rather tricky, is the easiest way is to look for the footprints. So you go into the sandy areas of these places, because the Houbara has a very distinctive footprint. Like all bustards, it's only got 3 toes. There's no rear claw. And then you can just follow them. This is what John is doing. And eventually you'll either find the bird or you'll know actually where it is in general, because you can find the tracks in the sand. This is a reg desert down there. So with a sand, reg, and Harat, the boulder deserts. We're just recording everything we can think of that might be useful. I took all this data back to University College London, where I did my MSc, and pulled a few beers to help for somebody to give me access to their computer to analyze this Landsat image. I mean, in those days, this was very, very difficult technology. Google Earth, of course, is quite different now. You had to buy this from NASA directly, came in cans of tapes that all had to be uploaded. Anyway, I won't go into the details, but this is the image we got. And then we placed all our sightings of birds, habitats, vegetation, everything on that. And we discovered that there were two areas which, if you looked, it's called training. Once you've identified as small areas where we knew it was good habitat, you can ask the image analysis software to find all the other places that are like that. And this is what we came up with. And you can see, even by eye, just how different they are. There's a different patterning completely with the rest of the area. So and once you start working in there, you get to recognize it. You become a Houbara, and after that, you can, as we did, start to find them. And so we put our base camp there, naturally, right in the middle of the two, so we could get to them very easily. Base camp was rather spectacular, on the edge of a volcanic rim, and there were wolves up there. There's a lot of wildlife in the desert. It's just very difficult to see it sometimes, and even harder to photograph it, which is why you're not seeing many such pictures. Anyway, there we were, 180 to 200 miles from the nearest road. One caravan, two vehicles, me and an assistant, camping there for several weeks, and occasionally going through the desert up to a base camp 60 miles away to get fuel. It was wonderful, absolutely amazing. And I wanted on here to put some more photographs, but unfortunately I couldn't find them. But it was a lovely place. The other thing I wanted to do was, having found out where you could find them, and I should say more or less within a week, we were seeing displaying Houbara in those areas for the first time for nearly 40 years in Saudi. I wanted to know then if we could track these birds, because obviously rings wouldn't really do it. And just at that time, satellite telemetry was beginning to come in. It was being used in North America on bald eagles. Well, the Houbara is a bit lighter and smaller. And we could only get the electronics at that stage down to some pretty, well, experimental designs. That was the first one. It's just round. And I just strapped it on the Houbara to see what it looks like and take a picture and then take it off, because it's all I know is you can get a signal from it. This one was a bit more aerodynamic. It was oval shaped, or sort of that kind of triangular shape, and a bit smaller and quite a lot lighter a year later. But this kind of thing, the Arabs were really interested in and would pay, you know, there was no problem getting money to do this research at all. So I would have my ground kit here. So that's a local signal receiver, and I could tell where the birds were sitting and checking that I could find them on the ground. And eventually, of course, within a few years, by the 1990s, we had these solar-powered, really small American Argos transmitters going up to a satellite. Now, current generations are all using GSM telephone systems, but then it was all going to satellite, and putting that onto the back of a Houbara started to get results. The next thing is that Houbara, of course, is a captive one. So now we have to catch wild Houbara. Nobody really, we knew how they were trapped in Pakistan, and that was quite brutal. They're using snares, and we didn't want to use snares because we didn't want to damage the birds, obviously. So we tried, first of all, growing alfalfa because we knew from other work that bustards will go to alfalfa. So we started off with the alfalfa. It's, now looking at it, it's a pretty silly, but anyway, barrels of water, going there every day to water the alfalfa because if you don't, it dies pretty quick, and hoping that a Houbara would get close enough to that and we would work out, we'd put a net around and hoping it would walk into a net. It didn't. And so then we thought, well, maybe we can use something like this trap, because we know that also Houbara did walk into traps. So we designed this mesh cage that on the floor is the release, which brings the door that's hooked up at the top down, and a pot of alfalfa in the back, thinking, well, Houbara walk in there for a peck at the alfalfa, and that could seal its fate, as it were. That didn't work either, but it did actually work for monitor lizards. So we were catching those. And on top of that, actually, one morning, watching the area to see if because we didn't operate the traps at night, you know, it was, I was watching to make sure that if a Houbara went in and was caught, we'd get it pretty quick. But here, I saw, it was too far away to get a photograph, but those are the tracks of a caracal lynx coming to inspect this cage that's got the monitor in it. And that was the first record for nearly a century in northern Saudi. So the protected area was doing its job. Wildlife was starting to return. So changed tack again. We built a high this observation post with boulders, and that was good because you could, the birds just didn't have any problem with that. It was natural materials, and you could get close views of loads of larks coming, buntings coming, and actually a feature like that in the desert attracts a lot of things, including solifuges, which weren't quite so welcome. These big spider-like arachnids with these fearsome jaws. They're not venomous like scorpions, which were also quite abundant in there. But if you got bitten by one, you would certainly know it. One of the things that came close to my little hide was cream-coloured courser. I saw it one day quite close, and I set up a time-lapse camera on it. And I got this photograph. Suddenly I realised it was on a nest. You can now see the eggs just here. And I recorded that bird coming and going for several days. And one day I'm going to write a little paper about it. I don't think anybody's really done any nesting observations of cream-coloured coursers. They're very hard to find their nest. And one of the reasons is just look at those eggs. I mean, absolutely camouflaged. Even the markings, they just look like the surrounding stones. Look at that. So, having, after another year, we decided to do something a bit more sophisticated than a cage and try pneumatic cannons. Those are like huge air rifles that fire a lead weight, and nets are tied to them. They were using them on the Walshway to grip, well, they had rocket nets and pneumatic cannons there. So building here a little wall, because Houbara, we know, when they, bizarrely, bustards, when they meet an obstacle like this, they walk along it. They don't actually step over it. They walk along until they find a gap. So we built out these long lines of boulders with little gaps in, and installed very large water tanks and a solar panel system, solar power, to feed these areas. You can see with irrigated system, and grow our pots of alfalfa, but now we didn't have to water them every day. And here you see the net, this white, this here, and the pneumatic cannon is just behind the picture. So the idea is the Houbara, which is sort of walking along. Oh, look, there's a boulder wall. I'll follow that because I think I can spot some alfalfa, come through this gap, get into there, and then bang. That didn't work either. Eventually, my successors, because I wouldn't do it, they did catch Houbara and put the transmitters on, but then they used a falcon to do that, and they bound up the beak and they put wax and stuff on the claws, so the bird was caught but not actually damaged. No doubt, absolutely shocked, but there we go. So we did actually start to get some data about where these birds were going, and it was just amazing, from UAE to China and back in 2 steps. So they didn't do it in one go. What happened was that the birds were migrating from UAE to northern part of Iran, Turkmenistan, and I'm not quite sure if that's Kyrgyzstan, anyway, one of those stand countries. And they would stop there and for some weeks. And we found out that they were breeding there. And then the males would move on to China and spend another few weeks over there displaying again. And what it was is that they got 2 breeding seasons because they were following the thermocline as it moved north. So they got 2 springs and then came back. So nobody had really thought that was happening. Well, first of all, we never thought they were going to go, to Inner Mongolia for the breeding, but they did. So on their way, they're going through Kazakhstan. So I took this guy, Mohammed Al-Buadi, who's now the Minister of Defense of UAE. He's got rather busy these days, but he was in charge of Abu Dhabi's Bustard breeding project, and got him up to Kazakhstan to meet ministers there. And we eventually signed an MOU with Kazakhstan to cooperate on, Bustard breeding, but also starting Kazakhstan's first protected area program as well in their desert area. And that was a second highlight that about 8 years ago, Kazakhstan declared virtually the whole of the Baikal, Bakpakdala Desert as a protected area, the first step area in Kazakhstan to be declared. But over time, we were getting more and more data about these migration patterns. So we began to understand where the range states were and how important different ones were. And we were able to start drawing up different texts for a potential agreement. So what we were aiming for was an agreement under the Bonn Convention, which is the conservation of migratory species of wild animals. I'd already, in my role as working at BirdLife, then International Council for Bird Preservation, which is still its official name, actually. BirdLife is just its sort of public name. To get the Africa-Eurasian Migratory Water Birds Agreement in 1999. We did the Middle European Population of Great Bustards in 2001. And I also wrote this one for the Migratory Birds of Prey in Africa and Eurasia in 2008. So we use those as models to think about an international agreement for the Asian Houbara. And Saudi was sponsoring it, but actually did nothing. They even became a party to the Bonn Convention as part of this process. So did UAE. But Saudi used it as a way of stopping things, and UAE wanted to use it as a way of moving things forward. So it became a clash between these 2 countries as to how to pursue this agreement. But Saudi, being the bigger country, eventually won out and just just took everything very slowly. Yes, we're doing it, but nothing happens. Yes, we're going to do it, but nothing happens. These are the range states for the CMS, the blue countries. So the Houbara's migration from Saudi goes through, and China is not a party, but they definitely go into Mongolia. So all of that, in fact, the whole migration route is covered by CMS parties, so it was perfect. So we drew up a draft agreement and presented it to the ICBP BirdLife World Conference in 1990, an agreement on the Houbara Bustard. And this provided for hunting areas, buffer zones, protected areas, a certain amount of, quite a lot of research on captive breeding, because you had to, that was the way to engage people in the Middle East. But mainly it was a way of collecting population data so that you could have quotas of the number of birds that could be hunted in any particular year based on population dynamics data. So if we were able to, out of all those thousands of birds, if we just collected one primary from each one, we'd be able to tell its sex, its age. We could do DNA analyses to look at interrelations and so on. And from that, we would pick up a whole population dynamic model. And from that, you could just run it forward and say, okay, this year you can do 2,000, or it wasn't such a good breeding season. This year it's only 1,500. Ideally, we wanted to actually auction the quotas, because that would be the best way for Pakistan to make more money transparently rather than under the counter. But Pakistan is Pakistan. That was never going to work. But the Australians and the New Zealanders do that for fish. I wanted something similar for Houbara. And then we got, in 2005, nothing really happened. And in 2005, we tried again, this time with UAE. And then finally, that didn't, Saudi just blocked it. And then finally in 2017, Bonn Convention decided to scrap the whole idea, and they took it off their list of potential agreements. And that remains the case to the present day, unfortunately, although there are now some signs that most of these old hunters have died, Sheikh Zayed and Sultan and so on. And their successors, mostly Western education, are starting to get it, that maybe they should do something for biodiversity, and maybe there are some now signs in 2023-24 that we might return to this project again. Meanwhile, they carry on with the captive breeding. That farm is in full operation. They set up something called the International Fund for Houbara Conservation. And they are producing, here it says, global target of 50,000 Houbara a year. That's a half of the wild population. And they're treating them almost like, well, they are tame birds. And this international fund aims that, if you look in the last paragraph here, it's announced the release of 549,860 Houbara in 17 countries since 1998. What's actually happened, and now the research is coming out, is that this has absolutely swamped the wild population, just like salmon farming has swamped wild salmon, and we're getting the same effects, genetic deterioration, because all these bred birds, of course, they're not genetically diverse. They're in a bottleneck situation because they all come from a very small founder stock. They've even been crossbreeding the races from Africa and Asia. And we're now not really sure what is a wild Houbara anymore in some countries, especially Morocco. So if you've seen one in Morocco, it's not really wild. It's a released feral bird 90% of the time. Sorry about that. Reproductive, and furthermore, these concentrated breeding schemes and releasing completely unfit birds into the wild is having a depressive effect on even the breeding success of the wild bird. So the whole thing is really going the wrong way again. And now some people, like Nigel Collar and others, are starting to publish papers complaining about this, and it just feels we've gone right back to 1976. The same thing, all this. On that rather sad note, I thought I would just finalise my talk with something a bit more optimistic with this slide of Gertrude. She's a Russian great bustard that we brought over 15, or maybe 17 years ago now. That project is actually last year was its 53rd year from the original start of the project. She's sadly never found a mate, and we don't see her for nearly all the year, except in spring. She comes to walk around Stonehenge. So if you want to see a great bustard, even if it's a Russian one, you could try Stonehenge. And the Great Bustard Project, we've got 60 birds in the wild, breeding successfully, population slowly increasing. Encourage you to the Great Bustard Group website. You can go and visit them. There are guided tours 3 times a week. And if you want to photograph them, there's even a specialist photographic hide, which is exactly positioned on the leg. So you can have these magnificent pictures of the males. I could have shown you some, but that would be a bit over the top. You'll have to do it for yourself. So on that note, I thank you very much for your attention and hope I haven't exceeded my time.
Thank you, Paul. My goodness, you've been so committed and still are, I guess.
Yes.
Amazing. Absolutely amazing. You answered a lot of the questions I actually wrote down that I was going to ask you actually during the course of your talk. But I was going to say, do the monitor lizards eat the eggs? Are they one of the natural predators to the Houbaras?
I think they would do if they found them, yes. But we know so little about what actually, the most likely main predator is the fox, of which there are a lot in the desert, actually. When you're sitting around at dusk, they're just everywhere. So I don't think the monitors would be a main predator compared with foxes and brown-necked ravens, probably.
Oh, okay. Right. Does anybody, I think that's all I was going to ask. Are they also, I was going to ask, are they easy to catch, but you described the process. Yeah. Does anybody have any questions for Paul? Yes, Robert.
If they've released 500,000 of these birds, are they getting anywhere near close shooting?
What do you mean by close shooting?
The
Oh,
birds that were released, or are they completely swamped?
well, what actually?
Can I just repeat the question? You said if they've released over 500,000 birds, are they
Getting close to shooting?
getting close to shooting that number?
The answer is no. And actually, they're starting to realise that this is not sport anymore, because those birds, literally, because they've been hand reared, don't fly away. And the whole point of falconry, as I showed there, was that in the original form of the sport, it was very exciting. It was important that the falcon caught this wild bird. And if you had a falcon which could catch, say, 5 or 6 Houbara in a day, you were a really important person for that, to be able to train a falcon to do that. Now, they release the birds, and they come a week later, and the birds are still practically in the same area, and they won't fly. So they're actually ruining their own sport. So they do end up shooting a lot, but that's not, they don't need it for the food anymore. So the whole idea was to be a good falconer, according to your cultural heritage. And we're only talking 2 generations from when they were Bedu. So it's still important.
It doesn't upset the balance a bit then?
Yeah, as I described, it's depressing the breeding regime. It's creating inbreeding, genetic deterioration. And on top of that, it doesn't even provide good sport.
When we were in Fuerteventura a few years ago, we did see a Houbara, and I didn't realise the significance of them then, actually. Well, what's the population of them on Fuerteventura?
It's large for the size of the island, several hundred.
And they're presumably not persecuted in any way. They just breed quite
There's
freely.
poaching, but it's not significant. The main threat to them now is wind farms.
Oh,
Not that they're flying into the pylons directly, but there's a lot of disturbance, and they're very sensitive to that.
Oh, okay. Does anybody else have a question? Yes.
What about Mongolia? How did they get on in Mongolia? To what extent does the cultural practice and so on have an impact on the numbers of birds? Do you know?
Paul is being asked now how the birds are getting on in Mongolia.
So not many of them in Mongolia, nor in China. I mean, we know they go there, but most of them stay in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, as it turns out, with more data. The Mongolians, for them, falconry is also a tradition from horses, but they tend to use eagles rather than sakers, and they're hunting antelope and goats and things like that. They don't hunt houbara. It's so that my Mongolian colleague doesn't even, he works on the Asian great bustard, which is very rare. He doesn't think it's really worth his time dealing with houbara.
Okay. Yes.
You mentioned that we're getting the head around captive breeding clusters. They do a captive breeding in the falcons.
Oh,
Couldn't quite
absolutely.
catch that. I couldn't quite
Sorry,
catch it. Can you repeat the question?
So the question was that they're captive breeding the houbara. Do they also captive breed the falcons? And the answer definitively is yes. I mean, in big way. So people like Nick Fox, who was instrumental in the early days of the red kite reintroduction project, has a breeding station in Wales. Most of his income comes from breeding falcons and training them for lazy Arab hunters who can't do it themselves. And they own quite a lot of the game estates actually in the UK, and they train their falcons on these private. They're not, you can't buy a gun there. It's by invitation only, that hunting. They had a little bustard on there once, which was never reported officially. And then in the Middle East, it's a bit more tricky because in the summer, it's really very hot and the birds don't take kindly to that. So they don't breed under, except in air-conditioned aviaries, as I showed you. And even then it was very tricky. And I helped them with that problem because we had exactly the same with the great bustards initially. When the first birds were bought from Portugal, the males didn't go into display until May. And the females didn't lay fertile eggs because their hormonal cycles were out of sync. So it occurred to me that the males were not displaying until May because of the time difference. They were using the light day length signal to get the testosterone going for them to display. And the females have to see the display before they'll produce eggs and lay them and copulate in May. And lay. So by the time the eggs were laid, it was too late in the season for them to rear chicks, even if they got fertile eggs. So the question was, how do we get the males to display earlier? And after talking to a couple of vets, we actually inoculated 2 of the male bustards with these little testosterone pellets that you use for dogs. Bingo, they started breeding. They came into condition at the right time. And when they were telling me, actually, the reason I went to that place that they asked me to go there was to talk to the vet. And I told him this story. He just said, well, maybe we can do the same here. And I said, well, as it happens, I have my injector with me because I was thinking I might use it in Pakistan on a captive bird. And we used it. And he rang me up a week later and says, it's worked. The male's now ready to go. So most of the captive breeding is done with artificial insemination. The issue, though, is that the Arabs want these pale, big birds. So what you're seeing is a lot of hybrids crossing peregrine with saker, saker with jur, jur with peregrine, and it's becoming very mixed up to try and get, the ultimate falcon. Because jurs is not. You saw that picture of Sheikh Mohammed with this jur on his hand, but they're useless hunters. I mean, they just they won't go for a Houbara. It's just pretty. A lot of money for very, very little, in fact.
Well, okay. Yes, Neil.
Aside of state artifacts, is the situation regarding the trade in first trade to the Arabian Peninsula getting now, or are they still also taking or buying from the illegal trade to?
You can hear that.
Yes,
I'm repeating that.
does the illegal trade in falcons continue, basically? I mean, the answer is yes, but it's now much more furtive than it was. Partly because I mentioned that MOU. Eventually, they got an MOU for sakers as well in Kazakhstan, which was one of the main source countries. And what happens now is that the ornithologists in Kazakhstan, I mean, there's a group of them, they go to all the nests and they put these radio tags, RFID tags, in the necks of all the sakers. So if they are taken from the nest or caught on passage, every single vet now in the Middle East has a reader and can tell if the bird has been snaffled. So the trade is now more what's happened, and we also got the countries to join CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. Falcons are on Appendix 2 or 1. So it has to be declared, and countries like Kazakhstan do declare it if somebody's got a falcon legally there. It can be done if you do it through the channels. So you get statistics now. So when you see somebody going out with 100 falcons and the country's only got permits for 50, there's obviously something amiss. And Pakistan itself has got pretty tired with all of this hunting to some extent. And especially with the falcons, because it's ruining their international image on the world stage. So they're starting to regulate it and constantly confiscating illegal falcons. The problem then is what you do with them. But that's a different story.
Well, oh, sorry, we've got another one, have we?
Sorry.
Similarly interested in the population on Lanzarote, where she's seen both the Houbaras and cream-coloured horses.
Yeah, lovely. The population on Lanzarote is somewhere between 50 and 100. But I think some of them think that some observers suggest that Lanzarote, because it's more difficult terrain actually to survey than Fuerteventura, might even have more than Fuerteventura. What happened on the Canary Islands if you read Bannerman on the Houbara, on the Canarian Houbara, he reported it as extinct in the 60s. And when we set up the Bustard group under BirdLife International with Nigel Collar, this was our first target bird. Is it really extinct? And in 1976, I put a team together as a sort of very young man, and we went out and we found Houbara there. I mean, the local people knew that they were there. I mean, let's face it, some people write things without ever asking local people if you've seen one, and but we didn't find many. But we wrote a report and suggested, talking to the local authorities, that the main problem was poaching and overgrazing of the desert areas by goats. So we had noticed that the birds like to visit these little areas, which you will have seen there, where they make these little stone enclosures to grow market crops. And if somebody's put alfalfa there to get a feed for their goats, that's definitely where the Houbara will go. So we recommended setting them up as a conservation measure. And to their credit, Fuerteventura authorities did that. The junta did it. And that had two effects. First of all, it brought the birds in. So you knew where they were, and you could protect them there. And you gave them food, which was unavailable outside. And the population they very quickly recolonized Lanzarote, where they can find plenty of food, because Lanzarote, they got more precipitation than Fuerteventura, and so there's more natural food available for them. And now they're also on Graciosa. So they've done quite well there. So that was a good turn up for that.
Right. Well, thank you again very much for coming to tell us and for passing on your knowledge. I'm sure we've all really enjoyed it. It's been really interesting and sad and encouraging, but not.
Goes up and down.
Yeah, it does rather, doesn't it? But anyway, can we all just thank Paul once again for coming along to talk to us? Thank you, Paul. Right, now I just want to remind everybody about the photographic competition, which is on the 20th of March. Jane said she has received an entry already, which is nice. There's still time, obviously plenty of time. So do contact her and send your photographs. There will be prizes as per usual and the cup for the overall winner. Now, the next meeting now, just tell you about that, is with Paul Alistair Collins, and he's going to be talking about the Svalbard and Lake Kokini in Greece, and photographs he's taken particularly in those areas, plus others in between. And that's on February the 7th, which is 2 weeks tonight, and will be in here. So anybody at home, if you do decide you're going to come in this next time, then please do. And we are in G10 on the ground floor, not up in Palmer 109 due to the damaged screen. Okay, so thank you very much, everybody, once again for coming, and for all of you at home. Hope you enjoyed the talk, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Okay, bye-bye.